Welcome back to Story Deep Dive with Dana and Rachel. Y'all, listen, this is our early recordings of this podcast. So we are going to be fumbling. We're probably going to be laughing, but we are going to get to the bottom of this story. So before we get into our discussion on plot today for Ninth House, what you got going on over there, Rachel?
At the time of this recording, I am newly launching finally, listen, my husband and I had an absolute debate over the title of this workbook. It is the Complete Crime Writer's Workbook.
Oh, I love it. Love it.
It was originally the Crime Writer's Story Planner, and my husband was like, let me show you everything that has the name like planner at the end of it and what the contents are. You are going to confuse people. So it was Planner Gate over here at the Arsenault household as we debated over that title. But so that's launching today as we're recording. So that is going to be a complete all-in-one resource for planning a crime novel, from planning the crime, suspects, mapping out your clues, to actually getting them into a structure for your story from start to finish through all 4 acts. So it is, it's juicy, and I'm real pumped about it.
You should be. And listen, come on, hubby. Get her straight over there.
That's right. Putting his marketing brain to use on my titling of things.
Listen, sometimes we got to get a little help. Okay, so then that means people will be able to go to your website to be able to check that out. And it, of course, it's going to be like timely for what we're talking about today, too. And so, yeah, listen, because I'm going to need all the help. Okay. So let's see, over here, I'm in the same boat. We are closing out the year. So we just finished our virtual retreat. And so that is done, which feels really, really good. This is my last like semi-week of working before I have my holiday break. Listen, I got to figure out how to like not work, but I'm going to really try. And so we have that, and then preparing the last little bit to launch the new program in January. So it feels like a lot. Like, where did the year go?
I know.
Super fast.
Well, and then all of a sudden it's like, because this is my last week before the holiday as well. And it's like, why did I put so much stuff in this week? Like that, like I was like, oh, I'm winding down the year. Why am I ramping up everything? I'm so tired. It's Tuesday.
It's like, who signed us up for this? I did. Okay. Oh, my bad.
Literally, we were on a call like last week and we're like, you know what we should do is record next week. That's the perfect time to do it. And I woke up this morning and I was like, where am I? I have a podcast to record. I have to get to my desk.
Listen, y'all, this has been on the books for a cool minute. And so
by cool minute, really she means 2 years. We've been talking about this for literal years.
It's been so long. I had to find the notes to find the notes. It was so it's been a long time coming, but what we're about to do is get into this. As a reminder, extend grace, y'all, as we navigate these earlier episodes. And we are not doing a whole bunch of editing, so y'all gonna have to get in where y'all fit in. But I promise that it is going to be a worth your time. We are starting off with Ninth House, and Rachel's going to get us started on a little bit about what we're talking about today, and then we're going to talk about plot. So are you ready to deep dive into this story?
As ready as I'll ever be. I say that.
Listen, that does not instill confidence.
I know. You're like, everybody, hang with us, but it's going to be great. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. No, I honestly, though, seriously, I have read this book probably 4 or 5 times. This book just, I'm so excited to talk about the plot. So I am ready. It's going to be great. So buckle up, listeners and viewers.
That was given. This is about to be a bumpy ride. Okay. So with that said, I'm sure that we're going to remind you all several times, especially as we get the flow under our belt. But you do not have to have previously read this book. However, reading it is probably going to make it even better. I think by the time we finish this, you will want to read it. because it is that good. Even though I have many caveats about my journey into liking this book, uh, I will also say that there will be some aspects that will read spoiler because our intention is to help authors that want to write this kind of story, whether in whole or in part, have an understanding of what we see as editors as we dive into this. And so this is definitely grab your tea, grab your coffee kind of conversation, or put your headphones on and fold the laundry, okay, and stick with us as we move forward. And so with that said, if you'll go ahead and kick us off with the summary, and then we'll dive into plot.
Yes, ma'am. Let me hit you with a summary. So, when Alex Stern, a troubled young woman with an uncanny ability to see ghosts, is discovered by the magical underground, she is enrolled into Yale University on a full ride and inducted into a secret society that monitors other secret societies that specialize in different forms of magic. This gritty tale has murder, mystery, and intrigue that explores the thirst for knowledge, justice, and the price we are willing to pay for power. It is exactly as juicy as it sounds. All of that, I mean, it is just, Leigh Bardugo is my hero. It is.
First of all, that was the first time me hearing that summary, and I thought it was going to be like a two-sentence, like, she went to Yale, and then, listen, you had all the things. Okay, so we want to talk about plot, and where would you like for us to start in the conversation? And I believe the biggest thing that starts off everything is sort of the root of the plot, which is the genre, but you're driving.
Yeah, no, that's exactly where I would start as well. I think, and this is like the first note I wrote to myself about the plot of this book is I think at its heart, this story is a crime story, which is really, like, I think starting there is really important because I think it forms really the core of the story, because everything that we experience in the story, we really get, like, we're led through it through the crime story, which is what gives it so much drive, because scene after scene, so the story starts early with the murder of Tara Hutchins, who's the victim, and Alex begins to investigate her murder, and everything else that we kind of learn about the story and experience in the story is as she's investigating that crime. So it's really what's pulling us through the story, even though we have, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 other smaller mysteries that get wrapped around one big mystery.
I'm glad you said that, because as someone who my main lane is romance, and when I went to Amazon and looking at it, it just said like supernatural thriller or called a supernatural story. And I think understanding that you really are focusing on the crime sort of distills it down. And if you are someone writing the story, you can wrap it in all of that. But the crime helps you to sort of establish the foundation and the spine of the story, because it was a little bit slow in the very beginning for me. But then it picked up, and I find that just helps ground us. So with saying that it's a crime story, what are some of the things that we should know as we talk about the plot when it comes to a crime story?
Yeah, so what I'm looking for in a crime story is, so there's kind of a crime that kicks off the main events of the story. So of course the story doesn't open with the crime, but it happens by chapter 3. We're introduced to a murder. And then after that, we're watching our protagonist follow clues to try to uncover the murderer. And so what you'll notice is that the scenes are driven by the search for information that's going to lead us to the murderer. And so you're going to kind of kick off with a crime, and then you're going to have your protagonist moving from scene to scene. So they're going to get information in just about every scene, I would say, about the nature of the crime, getting clues about the crime, and that's going to generate for them whatever it is that they need to do next. So that's really where you get so much of the narrative drive in a crime story, is every scene we're getting a clue or some information, and that's driving us into whatever we need to do next as we're pursuing the truth. And by the end, we get a reveal of who the killer is. And those are kind of would say the bare minimum, that's sort of very core of what I'm looking at when I'm looking at a crime story and what kind of pattern you're looking for it to follow.
Mm. Listen, as soon as your hand started going, I was like, I know we are getting in there good. Okay. So I think even though we're going to talk about this in other episodes, I think it's really important to know that as we meet Alex and she is in her environment at Yale, it does kick off, but we also, it's sort of almost, even before we discovered the body, you already sort of had this mystery element. So I would really kind of also, as we talk about that crime, think about, I kind of thought of like this as a genre mashup, right? Of like, because you had the mystery, you did have the supernatural aspect that I didn't know that that's what I was getting into when I read the story. And then as we start, and that pulls us into her becoming what's called the Dante and her being responsible for sort of processing this crime and deciding whether it is connected to any of the I don't know what you call them in your summary, but the supernatural houses that are a part of this storyline. And I think maybe if we could talk a little bit about that so that we can ground it and then sort of move through some of the things that we learn and explore through the plot as we move forward.
Yeah, tell me more specifically what you want more of.
I think the understanding of like the how the sort of story is set up so that we do move through the plot. So meaning how Alex is there, y'all. Dana is the one who is not a crime writer. Okay, listen. We like chandelier swinging, so I had to really get this because I feel like it's a crime story, yes, but for me, the person who is not the crime story reader, it was about all the other things too, of who she was and even her uncertainty of being able to solve this and how it was really served up to her as an open-ended, closed case, and her heart and her gut tugging her forward, which caused her to go on this like true journey. But we have Alex that's here as Dante, and Dante being, this is the part where you got to fill it in, but that she's in charge of what these other supernatural private societies, I don't know what you call them, are doing or not doing when it comes to their magical abilities and their how they're operating between their powers and humans, right? I think I'm being very, very elementary with that explanation. But so that when we find this body and it is what he calls a townsperson, it's a human, it should be open and closed of like, okay, you have no parts in this because it's no magical intersection with her death. But there's something about it that calls to Alex. And I think, which we'll talk about more in another episode, it's sort of her disposition as a person of being this person that's trying to navigate their way in this Ivy League school, and that it tugs on her, and she just sort of has this little inkling that I just want to get this one question answered. Is it really what it appears to be? And as she's starting to unfold that, like in my notes, I call it there's like to peel back the layers, that it really causes her to not just answer the questions about the death of Tara, but also the question of like, why is she there, and does she want to be there, and what does it require of her to be in this environment, and when we're talking about plot and we're talking about storytelling, as editors, I think a lot of times we can focus a lot on the plot, but don't really think a lot about how everything else folds around it, right? It really is the spine, but there are so many layers to Alex that I felt like even though she was tough, it's almost like she just had this I don't want to say it's this hard, but it's like she had a soft spot in her. But then sometimes I felt like she had a soft spot soft spots, but I felt like I didn't know if I was being deceived either because she had this uncanny ability to sort of be who she needed to be in the moment. And I wasn't quite sure until the end of, even at the end of like, did we really meet the real her yet? Which I'm sure we'll talk about more with character. So I'm saying all of this to say that was her role. So when she's investigating this crime, it becomes to basically it's not what it appears to be. And so I'd love you to speak anything on that other than me rambling.
No, I'm so pumped because I think that what you're like picking up and what you're sort of looking at is this like classic. This is something that I counsel most of my writers to do is like using the plot to drive character transformation, right? So the setup of the transformation that Alex needs to undergo, the setup of the plot is the perfect thing to challenge her to go to that place. So Alex gets this role as Dante. And what we learn early on is we don't really know where Darlington is. Darlington has disappeared and no one is 100% sure what happened to him, but we're going to try to get him back, but we don't have him back yet. And so what everyone also knows is that Alex doesn't really belong at Yale. Alex is an outsider. She is brought in again because of the specific ability she has, but she comes from, so she's from Van Nuys, California. She has a history of addiction, and the way that she was found was under very dubious circumstances, but they discovered that she has this ability to see ghosts, and that's why Yale brought her on. But so she's been brought in because of her gift, which is very rare, and she's really being brought on as a tool for Leigh, which is the House of the Veil that she works for. It's the House of the Veil that oversees the other magical houses. But when Darlington is called Virgil, and he sort of he outranks her, right? He's kind of at the top of the hierarchy, and then Dante is like his understudy, right? And so when Darlington disappears, Alex is thrust into a position that, all right, like she was barely, like no one thought that she was qualified to be Dante in the first place. Now she's the highest ranking officer in terms of students who are are a part of Leigh. So what everyone is expecting from her is sit tight, wait till we get Darlington back, because Darlington is the quintessential Virgil. He knows everything. He loves magic. I mean, he just is like, he is the guy. They call him the golden boy of Leigh. And so everyone is telling her, just sit tight. Just don't break anything until Darlington gets back. So when this murder happens, so it's unexpected, and Alex goes because it's her job as a Leigh officer to just make sure that nothing magical seems to have happened. And this is getting at exactly what you were talking about, Dana, where there's this one just kind of weird nagging question that Alex can't quite shake. And this is something we see really often in crime stories where you have a death that looks a particular way. It looks fairly straightforward. And then you have a protagonist who's like, okay, yeah, cool, I got you. It's fine. But I do have this one question. Like, there's that one weird thing, and everyone's like, no, that's not weird. Leave it alone. Like, don't worry about it. And they just can't quite shake it. And so they go and they start pulling that thread. And they pull that thread and it keeps coming out and it keeps coming out, now all of a sudden we're unraveling something significant. And that's how we, like the story, like the plot of the story is launching Alex into her transformation, because the nature of the conflict is actually challenging. And we will talk more about this when we get to character, but it's really challenging her self-perception, because I think so much of Alex's transformation is about how she views herself in light of where she comes from in her history, and having this responsibility thrust on her is what's really beginning to shift and shape what she thinks about herself and the way that she thinks about herself. But it's that murder that launches us into that, because it puts her in this position.
First of all, this is what I was talking about. Girl was like, Coach, tag me in, because I don't know these people's names. Okay, so y'all gonna get that real quick, okay? One of the things, yes, the crime did it. I also feel like something that I found interesting that I just can't wait to hear you talk about, which is like the way that is it Leah? Is that how she pronounces her name? The author?
I think it's Leigh.
Leigh? Okay, Leigh.
Yeah.
The way that the author, I'm gonna say it that way because I don't know her like that, okay, decides to handle the timeline and decides to handle the sequence of events also makes you feel like, okay, because really, yes, Alex is trying to buy time and she just wants to listen, she's on a free ride. She don't want to make no waves. She don't want nobody to even see her. And the moment that Darlington is gone, that veil, pun intended, is removed, right? And so she not only has to figure out what the heck she's doing, but she can no longer be invisible. And she still doesn't know how she feels about that, for lack of a better word, right? A way, for another way of saying it. And I think some of this, like, so the way that the author decides to use the timeline to reveal the plot, as someone who was reading her work for the first time, it sort of threw me off. But ultimately, because it's a thing that clients have issues with all the time, of like, you already have issues with having one timeline, let alone bouncing between timelines, and let alone doing it seamlessly. And so us realizing that she's in this predicament, and her gut, which you're calling that thread, which is true, is telling her something is amiss, and she doesn't know whether to trust that or to just let them to do what they say because they know what they're talking about. And she doesn't have Darlington to sort of hide behind or to even seek guidance and counsel from as she solves this. So she's like the amateur. She's the amateur in this whole thing. But at the same time, she knows more than what she realizes. It's almost like the fact that she is an amateur, or the fact that she has a very unique disposition when it comes to Tara's predicament, that causes her to feel like, I just want to get this answer for her. And when it comes to plot, I think it's, as someone, again, that's not a crime writer, I think it's helpful when you have this crime that, yes, she has a obligation because that's why she's there on scholarship, but because she has a hard disposition towards the victim, it's also what calls her into this transformation, right? It calls her into this journey. And so I'm really curious about, as you're going through this and looking at the different clues that are uncovered, I was blown away because of the fact I wasn't expecting ghosts. Listen, you recommended the book. I didn't even read the blurb. I should have read the blurb.
Just went in blind. No wonder you were like, Rachel, what is this? You're like texting me like, what is happening? What is literally even happening?
I was like, listen, I did not sign up for this. You know I'm scary. I know you scary. I was like, why would she pick this? We scary.
I literally was like, okay, Dana, I just remember like warning you, like, this is the other side of Rachel. This is the I like metal and gritty stuff side of Rachel.
Girl, in my brain is, I know you, girl. Listen, no, I did not know her. Girl, those ghosts, they're not Casper, okay? They're not your neighborhood friendly ghosts. So it's like, and I don't know how deep you want to continue on the plot, because I think that's the other part of it for me too, was like, how do you sort of balance the core of crime, but also wrap it in these other elements, the paranormal aspects, the magic aspects, because there's a lot of that. The fact that in reality, this is a true like a hero journey style story that you really could follow the elements of a hero's journey, and like how do you wrap that around the fact that still at the end of the day what causes this story to move forward, the pacing, even as she jumps timelines, is the actual crime. And I felt like she used the timeline jumping to be able to give us a lot of context, because in the present day it was the solving of the crime, but in the past tense it's sort of like poking holes as to why she should or should not be here, and the secrets that she's fighting so hard to keep hidden. And so I said a lot. Dive in anywhere you want to.
Yeah, no, okay. So I have so many thoughts that I have to make sure that I say one thought at a time and I don't get like a traffic jam in my own brain and my own mouth. So what I think works so well about this is using the plot as like the world that it's set in, the magic and the way that the world works is integral to the crime. And that's why as Alex is investigating the crime, we learn more about the world because the crime brings her into contact with the other houses of the Vale and how they work and what kind of power they have, because all of these things that were the kind of magic they broker, I think is more accurate. All of these things are impacting her perception of the crime. Was there a glamour on the murderer? What kind, like, were they using specific drugs on her that are like magical in nature? And so what it does is the investigation is actually leading her through the world in such a way that we're getting all of that world building as a seamless part of the crime itself. So the nature of the crime and the nature of the investigation is influenced by the context that it's in. And so it's almost like it gives you, I don't want to say unlimited because I wouldn't want someone to take liberties, but unlimited world building opportunities because all of it is plot relevant. And so she weaves so tightly the plot and the world that the story is in together so that you can get both of those. So as you're unraveling the mystery of the crime, which is like the main plot point that we're sort of following, you're able to relevantly wrap in all of this other information to flesh out the world in a way that we sort of have a sense of like buckets to keep the information in, because all of that information is plot relevant. Now, that's not to say it's not a lot, especially if this is not a genre that you come from generally, so that, you're like, oh, so much stuff is happening. There's so much world building. For someone who's coming from outside of the genre, it's still going to be a lot. But I think that it's done well enough that once you get into it, right, once you just kind of get accustomed to like, oh, this is what this story is, then you can really hit your stride. And then it makes those payoffs really, really satisfying. And that's also essential to the story, is the information she has weaved in is stuff that's helping with the payoffs later in the story so that it feels like an insight for us as the reader and it brings that sense of satisfaction.
I think, because I'm okay. I think one of the things that you said, y'all, I had a lot of issues with this story in the beginning. I was texting Rachel at all hours of the night, and I wasn't always a happy camper. And so I think one of the things that as you talk about basically the other elements folded around basically the revelation of the crime and the elements as she's moving forward, I think this is also where you start teetering on that line of like categorical fiction versus a literary fiction and how it's presented on the page. That I found, and in the beginning I found a little bit heady, mainly because she was doing her thing, the author, because she was laying the groundwork for you to understand the world that we were about to get like deep dive into. And I think it also made it feel as if it was gonna be, for me, a little bit fluttery. because I didn't know what to call it until stuff started happening. And I was like, wait a minute, wait, let me go back and read those pages again, because it's sort of like this balance of the world as we know it is not what we know it to be. And I found it so amazing how she sort of pitted that against that's Alex's regular existence, right? Of that the world that we know it to be, regular humans, is not what she knows it to be, because she sees them all the time. And the fact that it's always that juxtaposition there, I think it almost in its own way grounded the story for me, because when if there was one scene when she went on that field trip and that ghost sort of came, I was like, wait a minute, because I was almost up until that point tolerating it. And this is when I realized, like, wait a minute, what am I reading? Who let her pick the book first? But it also allowed us to consider, when we talk about plot, some of the themes that she was able to explore because of the structure that she chose, and the way we got insight into Alex, but also into her abilities. And I don't know, I'm sure it's probably a trope of a thought of the thing that she detests is the thing that they desire, right? And so, yeah, I'd love to hear anything that you have to say about that.
Yeah, one thing I can say, and this is something that I probably realized after, so I recommended this book to you, and then I've been writing about other books on Substack, and what I'm realizing about myself is that I love a book that sits right on the line of literary and genre fiction. That for me is my sweet spot. So that means that my recommendations will tend potentially a slightly more on the literary side. So I'm looking for stuff that sits directly on that line. And that is the stuff that I love, which makes sense then why, I recommended it and I was like, oh, this is the perfect book. And then right for you, it was this feels kind of literary. And it was oh, boy. The things I'm learning about myself along the way. But what's interesting, right, again, is her ability to see ghosts. And this is coming into also sort of character as well, right? Because the thing that she sort of loathes about her life is the thing that got her to Yale, and the thing that they want from her. It's also the thing that helps her to solve the mystery, right? So the thing that is, and I think this is a part of her arc as well, is understanding who she really is, what she really is, and learning to manage and navigate and utilize her gift, which again is a very heroic journey, right? But it's cool because it plays into some of the themes as well. So some of the themes surrounding power and access to power, because one of the biggest, and this happens, I think, fairly early on in the story, one of the biggest criticisms she levies against Darlington is, why did no one tell me that this is a thing, right? You guys have been watching me all this time. Someone could have told me that it there's not something broken in my brain, but that I have it and helped me manage this gift that caused torment through my entire life, right? And so Lethe only shows up when Alex can be useful to them. And so the opportunity allows her to begin to understand her gift, but it's also happening in the context of her being used by people in positions of power, right? So there's this weird dynamic that, and this falls into, I think, some of the again the themes of abuse comes up, and because the story deals with power dynamics and how people in positions of power are or aren't punished, right? What kinds of consequences, and how the consequences are different based on where you're at in the stack. Because a girl like Tara Hutchins faces different consequences than a beautiful boy from Yale like Blake Keeley. And the way that the dynamics work is different. And again, our mysteries are weaving us in and out of these themes as well, so that everything is coming together into this cohesive whole, so that the whole book is the whole thing is robust because everything is connected. So we don't ever get tangential themes that are like that, feel like they kind of are just like, this is a random thing that we're talking about now, but all of it is being integrated into the plot itself and the character's development and the nature of the context. And that's a thing that I'm always looking for books to do, is like bring everything together into one whole so that everything feels like it has its place, even though admittedly, right, like some of those, that major plot point is jarring and upset, right? You know what I mean? It's like there's no denying that it was jarring and upsetting as well. I think that it integrated into the whole, but that doesn't change that experience, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And I think like when we're talking about in a context here, especially if you haven't read the story, and I think because we have to dance around some things that you would want to read the story, I think it makes me think about how as a writer, being able to tackle issues that are a little more heavy hitting issues, and how you can do it in a way where it wasn't that it wasn't jarring, but it was almost like when you thought about it, like now some things weren't expected. I'm not even gonna lie, it just wasn't. But I think the way that you said it, sort of folding into it, is accurate. I think also once once the feel of the story sort of settled in, it made a lot more sense. So yeah, I do know what to expect when you pick books. But I think what it also did, it helped me to see, it's sort of this thing of like, how can you, it's almost like backdooring in on some things that you could, if you really wanted to, you could leave it out. Right? She could have left. No, I don't think she would have. She could have left out some of the abuse things. But I think the fact of Alex's struggles with her ability and her struggles, I think I guess the way it settled to me was with her lack of personal space because of her ability, um, her struggles with it, with being a young lady and a woman, and how she chose to address it because no one told her what it was. I felt like she just did an amazing job as an author, getting at some of those things that are rooted in um, how you identify who you are as a person. And a lot of that for Alex was disrupted by her gift, right?
Yeah.
And so as she's going along on this journey and we see this plot unfolding, it's almost as if she gets to reclaim parts of her that were taken, if not stolen,
Yeah.
because of the lack of information that she did not have. And that's the part that I think of me as a person and a reader, that I can sink my teeth into that. And that made a lot of what she was uncovering in the crime, it like made me sit up. Right. It made me pay more attention, because as she was juggling, and because she didn't have the buffer of Darlington, and she didn't have the buffer of drugs, and she didn't have even the buffer of friendship to keep her from experiencing this journey, whether she wanted to or not. And I don't know if there was ever a point where she didn't want to, but there were a lot of points where she could have just been like, you know what, I'm good. I'm gonna just write the report. It was nothing. But I mean, and because she had the courage to continue, it helped her to uncover a lot about herself. Um, that I'm sure we'll see more of in book two, but I don't want to read book two, but I'm gonna have to read book two. Oh,
No, it's so good. No, you have to. I can't even. I want to geek out about it, but I can't because it's gonna spoil stuff. But like for the listeners, but I do want to say I think something that you're picking up on that worked really well about this, even though she did deal with really heavy subject matter, is that she did like empower Alex to overcome in the end, right? Like and I think that that was a really important aspect of the story, that it's not just like, oh, look at this terrible thing that happened just so that the story feels dramatic, because that's where when this kind of subject matter comes up in stories, that is most often the thing that frustrates readers, and the criticism about it is that it's sort of this tangential thing, and which almost makes it feel like it's been treated lightly or like an easy plot point, versus pulling it into first of all, I think that it created tremendous empathy for Alex as she was before. So we understand the way that people view Alex, right? She's on drugs. She lives in this like ratty apartment. They have no money because they're spending it on drugs. And she looks so, right? She looks like someone that you shouldn't expect anything from on the outside. But what it does is, as it takes us through her journey and through her internal experience and the landscape of her world, it makes us reconsider that external appearance and produces. And I think that it has this effect of like, right, like a girl like Tara Hutchins is someone that we might think of on the outside as someone like Alex on the outside. But when we understand Alex, we understand these girls better, who come from places where they've been harmed, they haven't been given opportunity, right? And so it creates this empathy for Alex when she's strung out on drugs, when we see kind of who she was in the past, because she is trying to cope with something that is essentially unfathomable, especially because we're in this kind of horror supernatural space. And so first it helps us to deeply empathize with Alex. And again, as we get pulled through the story and as we watch Alex overcome her own past and her own experience, there's this sort of cathartic empowerment that happens, because it's not just a random thing that we see in the story, but we understand Alex better, and then we watch her overcome that past and that history in a way that doesn't just, and this is what I think is so wonderful, it doesn't just like Alex is like, I've come to terms with my past and I'm empowered now. But she actually brings justice for other people, right? She actually brings more justice into the world through her empowerment. And I think that those things make it, I think it works really well, and it makes it more effective because it has these sort of reverberating consequences that move out into the world, even just beyond her own development.
One of the things, as you're saying, I totally agree. One of the things that I also think that it did is not just give empathy for her, but it also, I guess, gave empathy or patience or something, because Alex is a little rough around the edges. And in the beginning, you don't fully realize. I remember one time when I called you about the story, and you probably don't even remember this conversation, and you were trying to explain, and as you were trying to explain why I didn't like it, and like all the things, and you and hubby had a sort of little, almost a tiny side conversation that made me go, oh, okay, that does make sense. Which is like, part of this was that you really didn't know. And I still feel like the plot helped to uncover this. This is part character, but I think this is part plot too. Like, you really didn't know what you were getting with her. And you really didn't know, I feel, the real her, because she really became good at having a representative. And I always tell my clients, like, what is their lovey? What is the thing that they hold so close to them and that helps them to cover up the wound? And part of her covering up of her wounds is the fact that she can adapt. And she's really good at doing it. But part of her adapting can almost make you not like her if you didn't understand, right? So I really don't even think it's just empathy. I think it's even grace, right? That you extend to her. And the more you realize, well, like, dang, well, I see why. It's great. Like, just because she goes through it, she goes through it. So to piggyback on what you're saying, I totally agree. I also feel like a part of it was helpful in understanding and being patient through her rough patches, and also how at just the right times the author helped us to get a glimpse into the essence of her, because she is loving, she is loyal, she is protective. And those are even things and qualities that she is not appreciating of herself that we get to see. And I just love that, which is probably just a quintessential, like, book one thing that we have to, because we have to invest. I mean, back to plot, like, we have to be willing to read book two and book three, and we have to see enough of them to know that her journey is far from over. But I'm curious enough to continue to see where this goes and how the other unanswered questions at the end of book one get answered. And so I needed that. I needed that because it just wasn't the crime itself, and solving the crime wasn't enough for me.
Yeah. Well, I think you're actually really getting on something important, though, that like when you're writing a character who's like very rough around the edges and they have a lot of like growth to do. We're kind of like shifting in the character a little bit, but it all like comes together.
Sorry.
No, how can it's like honestly, like, I take responsibility because I was like, this is about plot driving character transformation. Well, character transformation is on the table now.
I know it won't go into depth, but I think we have to. It is in this story. It's unseparable. I always tell my clients, like, it's like if you have a cake, you can't separate the egg once it's in there. It's in there,
Yep.
and so, like, go ahead, finish what you're saying, and then this will be the last thing we talk about on this episode before we talk about character. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that that's like a really important takeaway. If you are writing a character that is rough around the edges or has like a lot of growth that they're going to need to undergo, that you give the reader moments of insight into who they are capable of becoming, or moments of insight into, just like you said, like that essence, so that we can extend that grace, so that we can be more patient with them, because we see those redeeming qualities. And what we see is that they just need more time. They just need a little bit more experience. They need a little bit more care or growth or whatever to become that person. But I think that's kind of true with any character transformation, but I think especially with characters who are going to be really rough, or who, again, just have like a long way to go. Or maybe if you're looking at like a series protagonist who, is going to do a lot of transforming over the course of 3 whole books, because you got to pace it out, right, so that they don't finish the whole transformation at the end of book 1 and they have nowhere to go for books 2 and 3. But we need to see those glimmers of who they're capable of becoming and that essence of who they are, so that they do get endeared to us and we do see those things about them that make us want to stick with them, so that we're not just exclusively put off and we're like, ew, I hate this person so much, I don't even want to finish the book. Because then that's going to be a problem.
Right. And what we would normally, when we was just talking about, the writers in romance, is like the fact that they have to be likable and they have to be relatable. And here, I don't know if she had the likable in the beginning. You didn't dislike her, but I don't know if it was a likable. And I think even in that, the normal solution to that is sort of, we do the save the cat moment. We didn't have no cats. right? You just had to, you just had to, I think it's a sense of empathy on a level of being a regular person in an environment of exceptional people and trying to just walk like fake it till you make it. And then that kind of shatters around her too, right? Because she's like, ain't no faking this. You just can't. Okay, there's a couple of those small things I want to touch on before we close out this conversation, and then any like parting things that you want us to talk about before we sort of have like your editor's take in another episode or so is I was wondering, listen, we won't have an answer, but I just want to know if you felt it or if it was just me wishful thinking, whether there was like a potential super slow burn, like it was so slow that it wasn't even a burn, it was just potential or the spark of a love story.
Yes. Yes. Oh my God. Yes. I do feel like, and I really do think that she was intending to set up a romance as far as I can tell, right? But we do get, I mean, early on we get these hints of like, so I've done a lot of work on chapter 3 specifically, which is why I like refer to it from memory. But in chapter 3, when we're early on in the story getting introduced, Alex is on her way to the crime. When she reflects on Darlington, she reflects on the way he affects the people around him and the way that like girls are like, oh my God, he's so perfect. And he is perfect, right? He like jogs 6 miles every morning and he lifts weights and whatever else Darlington does, you know, and he's very polished and very charming. Right. And we get a very specific line of like Alex would like to have been immune to his charms, but essentially Darlington's a 10. He's delicious and you just can't help it. You know, and so and then we have right some moments throughout the story where we see their friendship growing. I think we see Darlington's attraction to Alex as well, but she's much more withholding, right? Because the first thing that she knows about Darlington is he's a rich boy in a nice coat who could capsize her without even meaning to, right? So that means that the way that she approaches or doesn't approach Darlington, right? A lot of distance, a lot of, you know, keep the space. But I do think that we are getting a very slow burn. And it's like one of my like, if it doesn't pay off in the end, because at the time of this recording, the series isn't finished. If it doesn't pay off in a delicious romance, I am going to be so upset because I love them together.
First of all, your idea of a delicious romance is... Listen, I'm gonna
Keep hard ladies bark.
Because I was like, oh, there was a couple of lines in there. I was like, wait a minute. And I believe I got the same sense. I got the feeling that the more he got to know her and she wasn't just facts and figures, and he realized that there was more to her, even if in the beginning it was because he was almost envious of her ability, something that he desired but in some ways did not have, and so it's like this perfect storm of the opposites attract between them, but at the same time having this sense of his book smarts to her street smarts, so it's a sense of balance there. Yeah, so okay, I was just wondering. Okay, the final thing that I would love for you to maybe talk about a little bit, which I feel like, I don't know, I can maybe only think of a couple of books that I would think is anything close to this that I've read before. And so I really would love to hear a little bit about your thoughts when it comes to the magic and her evolving, the fact that we didn't just have it in a sense of Alex, but also in the world that she was operating in, and the rules and parameters that she was operating in. And I liked that. I loved this sense of, I think it's pegged on the page as good and bad, but I really saw it as being sort of depths of the same thing. And almost in my brain, it was a thing of she experienced the darkest part of it so early on, but she's almost the purest representation of it in the environment. And so I would love to hear your thoughts because of your fantasy side, and then maybe even considering sort of how we, again, like before we wrap it up, like layer that into the crime aspect, which is still our foundation. But then we get this, it's almost like this icing, it's coloring on the landscape of the story.
Okay, so I think that when you're looking to almost like mash elements together, I would look at like two things, because I'm thinking about the world you want to set your story in and the plot that you want, the plot of your story. And what the big thing I would be looking for is asking yourself, and it depends a little bit on which thing you know first, right? So if you're working on a story, if you know the plot, like if you kind of know the plot first, then I would be asking about like, what is the kind of world in which this type of plot could take place, right? So what, or like, how is this plot? So let me say that again. On the flip side, if you have more of a sense of context than you do of plot, then I would say like, what kinds of problems are like going to emerge from this type of environment? Or how does this plot look in this particular context? So the reason I'm saying that is because when you're in fantasy, a lot of times people are coming at it from different angles, right? You know different things at different times. So I'm always thinking about what information you do have to help you get to the information that you don't have. So, but when you're wanting to integrate them, I think you're looking for how does the setting that you're in affect the way that this plot manifests, right? The way that it unfolds, the kinds of obstacles that your protagonist is going to run into, so that you're getting that integration of the two things, right? Where they're coming together so that your world is affecting your plot and your plot is reflecting back the world that it's taking place in, so that those things feel like they fit together and they're constantly sort of impacting one another, and you're creating that sense of weaving together. And the other thing, this is like a super side note, but it's something I've been thinking about. If you're wanting to do a dual POV, or not dual POV, dual timeline, which sometimes does do dual POV, one of the ways that I would think about doing that is, so you have your main story that's going to be probably the primary thrust, like we see in Ninth House. That second timeline, what I would do is almost like plot it out like as though it were its own story. And then I would look at those, I would put those two plots like next to each other, so that way you can time the insertions of that second timeline in order to make sure that the timing of your plot points is matching up, so that the pacing feels the same and it doesn't feel like, this one resolves way before this one, or they're like out of sync with each other. So that as the stakes are escalating, as they're complicating and developing, they're doing so in tandem with both timelines kind of flowing together. So those are two of the big things that I would sort of be looking at as far as your plot is like matching up your dual timelines, and then thinking about your world and how it affects your plot, and your plot as how it's reflective of your world. Does that all make sense?
Yes, but we could talk about that forever. I agree. I think I would never actually recommend anybody do this unless you have a really good grounding in story, because it didn't cause the pace to slow down, because the information that was being given was needed. And so that was a key. Now, it did make sometimes it hard to listen to. That it probably would have been a little bit easier if you were reading on the page, because it was a slight subtle change or a single sentence that sort of thrusted you and changed that timeline. And that was something that I got a better, I felt a lot better, a lot more grounded about it once I was reading the physical book versus the audio book. But yes, I agree. I think also the thing that you're saying about, I really like the thought of, the world being reflected back, because here the way that it sort of unfolds, it literally is unfolding. And I think that's one of those things that you really get to play with a lot in this sort of environment, right? When you have fantasy, it makes me think about like clients that are doing paranormal, but you really could do the same thing in contemporary too. It does make for heightening the stakes of the crime. And it also heightens, oh my gosh, like heightens the necessity of Alex to learn the lesson, right? To be like really present, because there were some of those scenes, like those fight scenes, and we did not talk about this. Hopefully we talk about it in the character, that this other like went there, because between the fight scenes and her, like, it just reminded me so much of when we read, which we'll be talking about in a future reading. It reminded me of the Sookie Stackhouse.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't see that a lot in romance. You'll see it in dark romance, you know, the almost like the protagonist being a victim in a sense of coming to physical harm. And so the point is, so yes, I really like the concept of the reflection. I think my mind needs some time to chew on it, but I think that's absolutely correct of what we're reading. Are there any other final things as we close out this episode, about plot that you want to bring to the forefront when it comes to, crime? And can I just say the caveat of like every crime story is going to have a lot of the backbones of what we're talking about, which is why we started there. But the nuance of this really is dictated by the circumstances and all of those other colorings that she did. Because I think sometimes if people are discussing this, they would lead with the magic in the world versus the crime element. And I think if you were thinking about writing it, that would need to be crystal clear. But yes, I'm sorry. I asked the question.
Yeah. No, I do think that that's what made the crime story so innovative, is because it is a crime story set in a very specific world, which again affected the way that the whole thing unfolds. And so that's really, I think that even just for like non-fantasy crime writers, using your setting to affect the details of the crime and how it unfolds and the kind of conflict that the protagonist runs into while they're investigating is like a huge opportunity to distinguish your crime story as something original and innovative, and to really so that your reader like remembers that story because of how specifically it unfolded. And again, it really integrates your setting as a part of the story itself. So I think that that's why that's so innovative and why it worked so well. As far as like just like that final takeaway, or like one last big thing, I think that when it comes to telling a story, especially a story like this, knowing, and this is why starting with the crime, that it was a crime story at its heart was so important, is because in order to not lose your own train of thought when you're writing a story like this, you have to know what the core of your story is. And this is true for even like if I were going to talk about a book like Mistborn, right, which has lots of nice subplots baked into it, you have to know what is the story anchored on so that you can build everything, we'll say, either on top of or wrap around it. Because otherwise, your reader is going to feel like you've lost your train of thought because they don't know what to focus on, versus knowing what the primary thrust of the story, what is the story about at its core, and then everything else we get to wrap around it to uncover the world and the other mysteries and all the other things that we want to know while we're moving on that central momentum, so that everything is, we know what's kind of like primary, secondary, tertiary, like we can track all those things so that they're all, essentially all those other mysteries are elevating the whole, like the central story, rather than detracting our attention from it so we don't know where to focus. So that would be like my really big takeaway plot wise, is know what your like the primary thrust of your story, know what your story is primarily about, build everything else around that.
Well, everyone, and that is it for this episode of Story Deep Dive. We will be back with the other episodes regarding Ninth House. You can follow us online. Left us off. I'm looking forward to having the rest of the discussion and getting to the juicy part. When are we going to talk about book 2? Never, not like. Alrighty, y'all. Have a fantastic day. And as always, happy writing.